It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you all to the G20 Interfaith panel entitled Addressing the Needs of Refugees and Migrants and Advancing Solutions, with a special focus. We will discuss one of the most important global topics related to social inclusion of refugees and migrants, especially vulnerable groups, women and youth from different perspectives. According to the UNHCR 2019 report, at least 79.5 million people around the world have been forced to flee their homes. Among them are nearly 26 million refugees, around half of whom are under the age of 18. Refugees and migrants face numerous challenges while they are in transit or they arrived to their host country, from economical, health, educational, legal, or political. Many difficulties are a result of inadequate policies which are neglecting some of the crucial aspects and effective mechanisms that can contribute to better social inclusion and creating a culture of dialogue between newcomers and host society. Different humanitarian organizations, religious actors, including faith-based organizations, had significant role in providing assistance for refugees, asylum seekers, and especially for vulnerable categories such as unaccompanied minors, children, asylum seekers, and especially women in the past years. Numerous grassroots examples and initiatives, especially from religious communities or faith-based organizations across the world, can serve as examples of promising practices and recommendations as a way forward to achieve a long-term social integration in our pluralistic societies. However, the world urgently needs a global plan based on inclusive policies and meaningful contribution of different actors in supporting social inclusion, building trust in local communities, and providing protection for vulnerable groups. In addressing this topic today, we have our distinguished panelists who will provide their input on this topic from their own field of expertise in order to tackle some of the questions and challenges of social inclusion, especially focusing on youth and women in our present world. The panel has 6 speakers, and I would like to introduce the first speaker today, Sheikh Mohammed Abu Zaid, Senior Judge at the Family Court of Saida in Lebanon. Dr. Mohammed, the floor is yours.
Greetings to everyone. And this is Judge Mohammed Abu Zaid. I'm the Senior Judge of the Family Court in Saida region in Lebanon. And being a judge in a family court, and this means all issues related to individuals and families from the locals and from the refugees come to my court. Then I'm in touch with every details related to personal and family issues daily through my court. Being a person living in Lebanon, we need to recognize that in Lebanon we have, of course, the Lebanese population, but also we have the Palestinian refugees who have been here in Lebanon since 1948. And recently we have the Syrian refugees starting from 2012. And it is a serious situation in Lebanon. About 500,000 of Palestinian refugees and about 1 million of Syrian refugees among 4 million Lebanese. Then we can think about every 4 people in Lebanon, we have one of them is a refugee. And it is a serious issue in Lebanon. Talking about this issue, we can think about stages in the relationship between the local community and the refugees. The local community is very welcoming at the beginning, but with time, tension will start to appear. There are fears because of
Sheikh Abu Zaid.
fears about some demographic changings. We can talk about competition in the work and fields of work. We can think about crime, a rising number of crime. Then, as for the Lebanese community, it started as a very welcoming community at the very beginning, but with time, fear started to appear, and maybe being suspicious about the presence of these refugees. Are they going to stay in Lebanon or they will go back home? But talking about the Palestinian case, it is more than 70 years now. Then again, now talking about the Syrians, will it last also another 70 years? Now we can witness a real tension, the local community. Now, what does faith-based organizations do? What does faith lead? It is doing the role of a mediator between the locals and the refugees. It is trying to make things calm down. It is trying to make these fears appear as an illusion, and that it is not something very real. And besides doing the relief work and doing the help and doing the service, the topic is more focusing on women and children. Maybe this is where my field of expertise comes. As a judge in a family court, I can say that the highest number of divorces is among refugees. The highest number of marriage of minors is among refugees. The biggest number of cases about conflict within the families is among refugees. Then we can think about being exiled, being living in a new community, not very familiar with the culture, with the tradition, has a serious influence on the family structure. And this will result a lot of children on streets just begging, asking for money. This will result a lot of women where husbands left them and they don't have any income and cannot have any kind of support because of the big number of the refugees. We can talk about a number of crime where juveniles are becoming part of some kinds of crimes. Also women, sorry to say it, working in prostitution. Then we can think about how war and how exile made these families come to a new place, a place where they are not very familiar with it and not well settled in it, and how this affected families and individuals, and how minors and women became maybe, let's say, the main victim of this situation. And this puts a huge burden on us as religious leaders, as imams, as religious judges, that we need to do our best to do the relief work with food items, with hygienes, with mattresses, but also to do the psychosocial support, to do also the teaching and raising awareness to try to limit the bad influence of this situation on the refugees. It is something very complicated, very challenging, but it is our duty to serve, and it is our duty to do our best to help. I cannot say that nothing has been done. No, a lot of things had been done. But talking about big numbers, more about 1.5 million people in a small country, a country which is very poor and broke now, Lebanon is a broke country, a country with very limited resources, that made it more and more challenging. Local community, which was very supportive at the very beginning, now the local community thinks that we as Lebanese need to be supported by someone. But still, now this is what faith do. Faith is about morals. Faith is about being helpful, being supportive. And though we are in need as Lebanese, our faith, our religion, our religious teachings inspires us to do good and to help, even if we are ourselves in need. And this is what is the Lebanese religious community is trying to do for refugees in Lebanon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheikh Abu Zaid, for bringing this important perspective from your legal practice, but also perspective as a religious leader in the community, emphasizing that living in the new communities bring tensions not only between refugees and migrants and the host society, but also tensions that arise within families living in a very difficult and challenging socio-economical environment. So this is one of the key questions that I would like to address further in our discussion, I would say, because it is really crucial to see how actually those divisions exist within community itself, refugee and migrant community itself, and many challenges that are related to the rise of tensions that exist in such circumstances. So I'm grateful for your intervention, and I would like to continue with our next speaker for today, Ms. Esther Lemon-Shaw. She's a global director of faith development at World Vision International. Ms. Lemon-Shaw, you may start your intervention in the next 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and greetings to everybody here. It's a real pleasure and honor to be part in this event. I'm working at World Vision International, and I'm so happy to share a little bit of what we have learned over the years that we have worked in World Vision. Most of our work is marked by disaster and structural vulnerability. So working with refugees and migrants is part of our regular programming. World Vision is a Christian organization and focusing on vulnerable children. And so it is part of our 70-year-old history and DNA to work with local faith communities as essential partners in the journey to address the needs of adult refugees and migrants. At World Vision, we are committed to continue to work with our valued partners, those on the panel today, but also others around the world, to do exactly this. Children deserve nothing less. While it's wonderful to have this discussion today and others that are happening on this forum, we also need to recognize that the issue we are discussing is not new. We know what works to end violence against children on the move, and we must move quickly to scale this up. In my more than 25 years of experience working in this field, I have seen faith actors meaningfully engaging to support refugee and migrant children and their communities. We have good evidence of faith leaders and communities providing spiritual support and care as a source of resilience, strengthening the continuum of care for child protection, and building social cohesion by promoting peace and combating xenophobia. As a woman and a peacemaker at heart, I feel I should point out the significant evidence that exists to show the effectiveness of women of faith as formal and informal peacemakers. However, we are still largely underrepresented in the peace-building apparatus and systems. I'm sure we all recognize that this has to change, and we all need to ensure the meaningful participation of women, girls, and boys in peace processes. Communities of faith play such an important role in welcoming strangers. We see all over the world, although we don't hear nearly enough of it, examples of faith communities showing willingness and ability to support refugees. A few examples: Canada's private sponsorship for refugee program, Italy's religious groups-led humanitarian corridor project, and opportunities for advocacy and support in many other countries. In Lebanon, churches have often housed, supported, and been a lifeline for Syrian refugees, primarily Muslim, building peaceful, cohesive engagement as both host community and refugee community had access to support through programs. World Vision's own experience includes our Channels of Hope approach, which comes alongside faith leaders to help them to discover their own calling for social change. In Lebanon, we are working with Sheikh Mohammed, Islamic Relief, and others to ensure children from both host communities and refugee communities are protected. This brings me to a point very dear to my heart. In addition to the work done by individual faith groups, multi-faith efforts bringing leaders from different faiths together to plan for and support children on the move together is essential. Let me tell you about one example from our World Vision experience in Central African Republic. We have a peace-building project that focuses on children on the move who were affected by the conflict, particularly children formerly associated with armed groups. We have worked with several partners, including local government operators and 30 religious leaders, both Christian and Muslim men and women, to improve the protective environment for children. My final point is about funding, resourcing. I think as people of faith, a lot is asked and expected of us. We ask a lot of ourselves and each other, often without the resources and support we may require. We cannot overlook the importance of this when it comes to equipping faith leaders with resources, training and information they need to increase their trust between groups and reduce tensions between refugees and host communities. It is clear that we engage religious community in our work with refugees and migrants. When we do that, a lot can be done. And it's encouraging to remember that at the heart of all of our faith is the need to protect and care for vulnerable children, especially those forced to flee their homes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lemon-Shaw, for your intervention and especially for emphasizing the role of faith actors, but also multi-faith efforts in child protection. Sometimes I believe faith actors are not that visible among other organizations providing aid and support, and they are definitely one of the key actors in that process. However, their role is very important, and I would say even key in many contexts. And also thank you for emphasizing that this problem, this issue is not new. And through history, children and vulnerable groups have faced similar challenges, similar situation of persecution, discrimination, xenophobia. However, what I would say it's different from other historical periods, especially during the 20th century. Nowadays, we are facing with numbers that are really high and alarming us to have to have actually the need for a joint action across different religious communities and different actors that are included in this response. So thank you very much for bringing this and also reminding us that this is not a novelty. However, I'm referring to a novelty in terms of its expansion and numbers that are currently present. So thank you very much for your input. We will continue with our next speaker, Professor Paolo Naso, who is a professor of political science and the sociology of religion at University La Sapienza from Rome, Italy. Professor Naso, you have the floor.
Thank you for the great opportunity you are giving me to share some ideas. But more than ideas, I would like to share a story. And thank you for the previous speaker who already mentioned the humanitarian corridors. I'm speaking from Italy, and I would say I'm speaking from the Mediterranean. And in the few minutes I have, I want to tell you how this experiment, political experiment, social experiment, humanitarian experiment started. We live in the Mediterranean, and any year we number more than 4,000 people who try to cross the Mediterranean. Why this horrible mass murder? Because there are no legal ways to enter Europe for the refugees. Exactly the refugees that Sheikh Mohammed mentioned in his presentation. These people living in refugee camps in Lebanon, but also in other countries like Ethiopia, Libya, and so on. If there are no regular ways to get safe protection in Europe, it's very obvious that many migrants are so compelled to try illegal ways and very dangerous routes. This is why we have so many people who are trying to get Europe through the human traffickers. How to avoid that? It was our dilemma after the terrible accident that happened in the Mediterranean near by the little island of Lampedusa exactly 7 years ago in 2013. 368 people died in that casualty. And we started considering what can we do, have church people. I am representing the Federation of Protestant Churches in Italy. What can we do, have people of faith, to try to avoid this strategy? So we connected to the community of Sant'Egidio that you very well know, try to explore the legal possibility to open safe channels facilitating regular legal migration from North Africa to Europe. We explored the legislation. Finally, we arrived to consider Article 25 of the regulation of the Schengen Treaty on visas. I know it's a very unknown rule. It's never been implemented, or it was never implemented, but we tried to elaborate a project in order to use this article so that the asylum seekers could get a protection, humanitarian visa in the sending countries. So, in our hopes, we were considering Morocco, Lebanon, and Ethiopia. So basically, we made the program. We discussed and negotiated the project with the Italian government, and finally, after a strong negotiation, we arrived to sign a protocol in 2015, allowing 1,000 people to leave different countries through the humanitarian visa. When these people, asylum seekers, arrive to Italy, immediately they make the request to be recognized as refugees. The system was adopted by the government. We started with 1,000 people. Eventually, the protocol was renewed for more thousands. Then in France, a very similar started. Then in Belgium, in Andorra, and nowadays we are considering the possibility to have a similar project starting in Germany and in particular in the region of North Westphalia. So the key of the project is vulnerability, and women and children are the most vulnerable victims that we consider for the humanitarian corridors. Our hope, I would mention three major hopes. Number one, to make the Italian experiment an European experiment, so that the European countries, the European institution, will open safe and legal passages like to the humanitarian corridors. Number two, we hope to open a hub in Libya so that another country, very critical country, can be relieved by this project, and especially targeting the most vulnerable, so again, women and children. Third, the experiment started as an ecumenical one, Protestant and Catholic, but our dream is to try to extend this experiment so that other communities of faith can join us in a spirit of global service to the needs of those for those who are in a very desperate and vulnerable situation. This is where we are. This is our story, and we are very grateful for the opportunity we are giving us to share this story today.
Thank you very much, Professor Naso, for bringing insights from Italy and mentioning humanitarian corridors, as well as addressing one of the most important questions when it comes to illegal ways and legal paths for refugees and migrants are using, and the dangerous routes that are inevitably there, and rising the problem of also human trafficking. I believe that one of the common sentences that we are hearing from other speakers as well is the presence and important role of multi-faith action that you also have brought into perspective from the Protestant churches as well. So I hope that in the discussion we can also address more on that and specifically see what is the concrete contribution that multi-faith action can bring in order to actually overcome or support overcoming some of the challenges that we are addressing today. Continuing our conversation, our next speaker is Ms. Anud Al-Fayasan, alumna of Salam for Cultural Communication. Ms. Anud, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me the floor, and thank you for the Syrian Committee of the G20 Interfaith Forum for having me represent the voice of the youth in this panel. Never before in history has the world seen more people displaced than today. Ranging from refugees to migrants, at least 79.5 million forcibly displaced worldwide today, which is the highest since World War II. 25 million refugees are under 18 years old, and as we know, unique challenges call for unique solutions, of which the creative and infinite perspective of the youth is very much needed to advance the solutions and also to build the capacity to address pressing needs. The youth have been chosen to focus on the three main areas to tackle, of which they believe could alter the story of the many women and young people who need it most, by focusing on social integration, countering gender-based violence, and ensuring equal employment opportunities. In this way, we make sure that these young and female refugees and migrants can put their best foot moving forward in integrating within their communities.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your input and for briefly sharing your insights when it comes to youth contribution. And I believe that later on in the discussion we can speak about more concrete recommendations and contribution of the youth group to policy makers, and how the voice of youth is very important to be heard, and on the key decision-making level, especially since their insights can provide a valuable input for solving some of the major problems. Thank you very much, Ms. Anud. And now I would like to invite Dr. Pritpal Kaur Ahluwalia, Education Director of the Sikh Coalition and Co-President of Religions for Peace. Dr. Kaur, please.
Thank you for the introduction. I would like to offer some reflections today on the subject matter from a Sikh faith perspective. I myself am the granddaughter of a refugee who survived the partition of India. I'm the daughter of immigrants, and for the past 5 years I've been an immigrant myself. The Sikh faith, or Dharam, teaches us that we are all in fact spiritual travelers or migrants, and that our role here on earth is only temporary. My grandparents and parents faced real challenges with language access, racism, and economic hardship. However, when reflecting and preparing my thoughts for today, I realize that I also speak from a place of great privilege. When I think about women and youth, the most powerful experience that comes to mind is recently becoming a parent. I had a safe home, a stable economic environment, and unhindered access to medical care throughout my pregnancy and during childbirth. I had social, emotional, spiritual, and medical support in the rewarding but challenging months that followed. And when the time came, I had the means for help with childcare when I returned to work. These critical and essential circumstances, which are the very foundations of families, are privileges that are not afforded to so many women and children who have been displaced from their homes. If we were migrants, what kind of welcome would we want? What kind of support would a pregnant mother require? And what kind of loving environment would a newborn need for nurture in order to thrive? So what can be done to address some of these real challenges that women and children increasingly face? Religious communities can encourage greater responsibility in meeting the needs of women and children through greater opportunities for interfacing at the policy level. Creating channels such as consultative forums for meaningful engagement and recommendations from religious communities is essential. Governments must realize that addressing the needs of refugees and migrants is a shared global responsibility. There are many teachings in the Sikh Dharam that underscore this responsibility towards humanity and emphasize the importance of equity due to the equality of all human beings. Sikhs believe that we are all creations of one God, and therefore we have a shared responsibility towards all of creation and towards all people. Verses from the Sikh sacred scripture and eternal Guru, the Guru Granth Sahib Ji, which illustrate this teaching, state that all human beings were created by the same light, Aval Allah Noor Upaya Kudrat ke Sabande, that we should not forget that there is only one God who provides for all, Sabna Jia KAICIID Data, and that the whole of humanity is one large family, Manas ki jaat sabe ek hi pehchan wo. We have most recently seen that the COVID-19 pandemic has not discriminated between countries, boundaries, and communities. Global humanitarian responses demand global solidarity, and globalization should be for the common good. This equitable approach is required at all levels, especially in order to build trust. Trust can only be built and reciprocated through partnership. It is a two-way street. There need to be greater opportunities for communication between the host country and countries of origin in order to approach this dialogue sincerely. Host communities should also not see themselves as superior. Migrants and refugees are an asset that, given the right environment, can enrich the host country. Host countries must also reckon with and face the truths of hard history, which have often involved colonialism and economic exploitation of the migrants' countries of origin. From a religious perspective, land and resources do not belong to anyone. They are gifts from God to be shared. In this respect, economic investments should also be made from the host country to the country of origin, and migrants and refugees should be given opportunities for housing in an equitable way, which doesn't force them into a cycle of socioeconomic poverty. Moving beyond policy, religious communities also create enormous change at the grassroots level. Partnerships with religious communities in the host country can support the needs of migrants and refugees in a variety of ways. They have the infrastructure and the means to help supply food and other essential resources. Community cooperatives and initiatives, often spearheaded by religious communities, can provide economic opportunities. And they can also meet their spiritual needs and cultural needs, such as language and customs. I will conclude today with some thoughts on how this change can be sustained in the long term. Religious communities can empower responses to refugees and migrants to be grounded in the values of love, compassion, and empathy. We are all accountable for our actions towards one another. The Sikh Dharam informs us that there is divine surveillance of these actions from the moment we are born. When we don't exercise love, compassion, and care towards others, particularly to those who are the most vulnerable, such as women and children, we render ourselves as lesser human beings. Values-led education, which focuses on developing traits such as empathy, sharing, and kindness, play a vital role in this. Thank you.
Dr. Carr, thank you very much for bringing this perspective also from Sikh community, but also from your personal migration history. I believe this is really a valuable experience also for the reflection on the questions that you have raised and important aspects, especially when it comes to welfare and socioeconomic protection of vulnerable groups, including women and children. But I also would like to emphasize the need for global solidarity that you have briefly mentioned, I believe, in the discussion when we address some of the challenges of the current pandemic, COVID-19. and how refugees and migrants actually were facing a pandemic in the last months, and the rise of the need for global solidarity is definitely even more present than it was before. But one of the key aspects that I would like to emphasize in your input is that what you are saying, that the need of a greater or more close dialogue between host communities and newcomers. This is definitely something that is lacking. This is something that I would like to discuss further in the Q&A part, and how migrants and refugees are seen as an asset for the host community and contributors, actively contributing to the host country. So thank you for bringing this important perspective into our conversation today. And I would like also to continue with our next speaker, Chief Imam Syed Razavi, Chief Imam of the Scottish Alol Abide Society in the United Kingdom. Imam Razavi, you may start your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And it's been a wonderful discussion so far. There's a lot to learn from this. And there's mutual interest, I feel. A lot of what's been said. That's why it's very difficult to go right at the end, fundamentally because a lot of things will overlap. But I think that's a positive. It's not a negative. It's positive because we're all thinking along the same lines. And so, as mentioned already, look, we are responsible as global citizens. There's a global stewardship, as they say. So whether it's individuals, religions, faiths, countries, communities, nations, we're responsible for people. If not today, you'll find that this cycle repeats itself, and over the course of an entire humanity, each one of our faiths has been, in some shape or form, refugees. As has already been mentioned, there's 80 million people who are displaced. Not all of them may be refugees, but 80 million people, because of whatever reason, are displaced. And that's a huge proportion of people. And one finds is that we, as people of faith at least, have a moral and a spiritual responsibility to humanity. But I guess there's a couple of points that I'm going to raise, and I know that we have now 5 minutes to go through all of those points. One finds that when it comes to refugees, there's a huge issue, at least on the basis of trust. And us working in Scotland, we have a multi-faith organisation which is dealing with refugees, led by the Church of Scotland. And I guess one of the biggest issues that we found is when refugees do come, there's an issue of trust. Because we're people of faith, what faith contributes is compassion. And for many people, they feel more secure speaking to people of faith, or at least religious leaders or people who look vaguely religious. The reason being is that there is a level of trust, compassion, and it gives them hope. So based upon that, I think that people of faith can have a profound impact. But I guess more so, there are many different avenues that people of faith can contribute to, religious organizations can. But I think it's not just for religious organization. I think there's a nexus that needs to be understood, and be it civic, faith, and then ultimately government, all three need to work together. There needs to be some kind of a synergy. And today you're seeing that there's a disproportionate amount of refugees in particular countries. You've heard about Lebanon. What about Jordan, for example? 57 different countries. Only recently, Filippo Grandi, the High Commissioner, we were having a conversation with him, and he mentioned he was in Jordan at the time, Amman, 57 different nationalities. And I believe that Jordan is punching far above its weight and its capacity. So I guess there needs to be a responsibility across countries, across nations, and I feel that today Europe can do much more, including the United Kingdom, which I'm currently in, can do a lot more. Now, let's say, for example, there is a lot more done, then what? And I'd really isolate it to 5 things, and I think this is where faith-based organizations can also work with charities to implement this. I guess the first thing is, as we've already heard parts of, is the idea that a lot of these refugees are suffering from trauma. So I think the first thing that we can contribute to is counseling. Counseling is extremely important, because otherwise, if you don't have that, hence, as you heard the first speaker say, divorce rates in particular families, issue of children, gangs and so forth. And I think the most important thing here is counseling. I guess the second most important thing after that is housing. You do find second or third world countries who are suffering in the sense that they don't have the funds or the resources to house all refugees who are coming in. There's places where there's camps, for example. So I think the second thing that we can work on, and I think that this is where multi-faith works, is housing. I think the third thing, which is going to be even more important, both for people of a particular country and for refugees who are coming in, is housing, is education. Why is education important? Because education will provide both ways process of integration. Many a time, especially within this COVID crisis, you've seen pockets of people who are despondent, they lash out against refugees. And I guess the big issue there is education, and vice versa. A person who's coming in, let's say, for argument's sake, let's say somebody's coming in from Africa or the Middle East, and they come into France or let's say the United Kingdom, there's a language barrier, there's a cultural barrier. So here's the third thing I would say is education. I guess fourth thing, which is very important, is that we're all doing wonderful projects. You've heard of some of them so far. I think the most important thing here is coordination. We must coordinate. There must be a network in place that we can coordinate to manage the expectations, to look at some of the good work that we're doing. And if there is a way of helping one another out, I think that would be a huge success if we can do that. And I guess finally, the final point that I want to raise, the limited time that we have, is the idea of lobbying. Religious communities in particular parts of the world do have a potential to lobby, do have the ability to do advocacy work with government. Some religious communities in some parts of the world are more heard by certain governments, with other civic and political organizations, and I think that there needs to be more done on this front. So, really in a nutshell, we could go on, discuss multiple other things which are taking place and projects as well. The one thing is that there are multiple projects. I wouldn't want to point one out or the other. If we can holistically deal with the issue in and of itself of migrants, only then I believe that we can give an opportunity for women and children, because who do suffer are women and children. As you've already heard, prostitution is a big issue, but why? Because there's no mechanisms in place. And I think if we can solve this 3 or 4, 5 points that we've raised, I think that there could be enough capacity there to be able to help counsel and at the same time support those people who are the most vulnerable from the refugees, so that they have a better future, a future whereby they too cannot feel like a burden. Unfortunately, some do feel like a burden, but they're not a burden. One must always remember we were all migrants once upon a time, in some capacity. Dating back from Adam to Abraham to Moses to Jesus, the Prophet Muhammad. If you look at all of those, and then parts of the Dharmic faith, if you notice, it's migration. We all are from the same root. We've all faced it over the last couple of centuries, millennia, and so forth. And I think, if that in mind, with our humanity, common humanity, I think if we do work together, we'll have a brighter future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Imam Razavi, for these reflections. Indeed, very important points that you have summarized very nicely, and especially when it comes to supporting refugees and migrants with the most relevant and, let's say, burning needs. When you mentioned the need for psychosocial support, this is inevitably one of the most relevant, along with housing and need for education. But also, additionally, a lot can be done on the advocacy level, providing insights from the refugee and migrant perspective to the policymakers, and trying to create this space, actually, where this kind of dialogue can take place. I think this is really one of the necessities in the future that we would need to expand even further, and to bring those voices, really voices of people who are refugees and migrants, who do have this experience from inside, and this insider perspective can speak a lot and can help a lot those who are creating policies on the government levels. So thank you very much for the round of presentations. We have heard quite a lot of interesting perspectives from our speakers today, and I believe that this will allow us to have a fruitful discussion, having all these different perspectives from different countries and different experiences that our presenters have shared with us today. And while we are collecting also questions from our participants and the audience that are presented in chat, I would like to start with a couple of questions individually for each one of you, so we can start discussing even deeper some of the emerging questions and also peculiarities of your interpretations. And I would like to start with Miss Esther, asking her a question that relates to her work at World Vision. How have faith communities and the voices of children and youth influenced World Vision's response to the Syrian refugee crisis? If you can comment a bit on that.
Yes. Well, the situation in the Syria response is that approximately 60% of the refugees are actually children. And then a big part of the others are women. So you can already see that the main target group of the people there are women and children. So one of the areas where I think is really important is that when people are displaced, they gather around aspects they have in common. So often they find themselves with people they don't know. So you find things you share in common, which is often faith. Sometimes it's a region that you come from, language or culture or something, but often it's faith. And so the faith communities are the first ones to create a sense of commonality of home in a displacement situation. And that's a huge important part to build their resilience, because if you have nothing to refer to, everything is new, foreign, you can't master it. The little you have that is known will give you a lot of sense of comfort and security. And that's so often also the faith leaders are part of those displaced people. And so we heard from everybody the importance of psychosocial counseling, spiritual counseling. The people to go to are imams, are pastors, are priests, are wherever that is. And so in the Syrian crisis, we have, for example, seen that even prior to the conflict, there were large levels of child marriage. And we've just heard from the Sheikh that is increasing. And we have made research that shows that child marriage has increased through the refugee community, the refugee situation. And I think getting the faith leaders, faith communities involved to cater for the needs of the vulnerable people, because often it's done to protect the honor of the girl, to provide revenue, food for the girls, etc. If we get the community to provide for the vulnerable families, that reduces the risk. There's no marriage that is done without the blessing of a priest or an imam or somebody. So if we can get the imams to come and counsel the parents to find ways to avoid that or postpone it until the girl has the appropriate age, that's a critical thing. So we've learned that working with faith actors, helping them to articulate how their faith relates to aspects of child well-being is really very powerful, because all the time they're engaging and counseling parents and even youth themselves. So their role is critical. I'll stop there, even though we could speak many more hours. Thank you.
And I would like to somehow continue with a similar perspective, asking on what you have actually raised now, asking Sheikh Abu Zaid a question. We are witnessing the rise of violence, discrimination, and therefore the increased need for protection of vulnerable groups, especially children. and women. And in many countries are failing to prevent this. What kind of unified action can be taken in order to increase awareness on this problem or direct some solutions? If you can maybe address this.
I'm talking from a Lebanese perspective, and I'm sorry to say it is not a very successful example here in Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
The situation in Lebanon is not very stable. A lot of challenges. Even the Lebanese who are settled in the country, who are living here since ever, are facing a real problem concerning these issues. Then what about those who came recently? The law in Lebanon, we have laws, we have different laws that underline domestic violence and gender-based violence, etc. But the government is weak, and there is no real power over such cases. Many people do such horrible things, and they still are free, and no serious accusation, and no serious trials, and no serious penalties. It is not, as I told you, it is not a very successful example. But that's why even me as a judge, I'm always relying on the authority of law, the authority of the government, but I'm more relying on the ethical teachings of religion. Most of the refugees, at least in my region here in the southern part of Lebanon, are practicing people. They come to the mosque, they listen to the imam. When they have some problem, they come to me, not as a judge. They don't come to the court. They come to the mosque and talk to me as an imam, giving an advice, playing the role of a mediator when there is some kind of conflict, trying to give legal and religious advice. Now, this is the two personalities, the judge and the imam. Giving both the legal and religious advice can do some help. But still, what is more needed is to have real state authority on all Lebanese and refugees, and real enforcement of the laws, and real handling of such cases. Since, as we say in our Islamic tradition, that all preachers can do something, but one single person with a strong authority can do a lot. Then maybe we need to rely on both the moral and spiritual authority that a religious leader represents, but also on the government, the state, and the law, and the authority of the state, to make things not only morals, but also by force, in case people insisted not to follow the guiding teachings of religion.
Thank you very much for your answer, which leads to my question that is really very much connected with what you have emphasized and reflected in your input now to Imam Razavi. How can religious communities, and especially religious leaders, contribute to building trust and overcome prejudices towards refugees and migrants, and especially in the context of Europe, which you have also mentioned? Thank you.
So, thank you again. It's a very good question. I think that there are existing networks of religious leaders that can be pulled, so it would be a conversation, a dialogue that can happen. And I feel that it shouldn't be the burden of one faith. So as you mentioned, it should be faiths coming together, faith leaders. I think that once these faith leaders do come together, there can be mechanisms in place for trust building to take place. Just to give you, I guess, two examples, I would say one of them is in relation to counselling. The religious communities can offer and provide counselling, what they can also provide into. And I'll give you an example that takes place in Scotland. Let's say, for example, Syrian refugees have come to Scotland and the Church of Scotland are involved, let's say, for housing them, helping them, they would then reach out to, let's say, us or others who may be able to speak the language, who understand the culture, for that intervention then to take place. Then it becomes a partnership. And that's a partnership under the watchful eye of the government. And I know for a fact that in this day and age with the current crisis and climate, governments may not have the resources or complete resources or the human resources to be able to come into motion. And there's been many a time where European governments have messaged certain of our colleagues to say, look, we need, let's say, this particular person to be able to do this job. And I think that before that stage comes, I think we have enough of the resources to be able to coordinate amongst each other. And so when that coordination happens, I guess there's trust building there. The first thing is this, that those people are coming in, let's say, from a religious conflict. They see Christians and Muslims or Jews working together. To give you an example, in London, the liberal Jewish community have done some phenomenal work to introduce refugees into the communities, into the London community. And when people see this kind of thing, it's profound. And the reason being is that it's a complete 180 from, let's say, a place of conflict that they're coming. Now, let's say, for example, you're an economic refugee. Even so, I think it helps to remove some of the prejudice. For any of this to take place, it requires conversation, it requires coordination. And then I guess with the religious communities, there needs to be charitable communities. So our charities, our NGOs, and there needs to be a partnership there, a body, some kind of, a council whereby discussions can happen at the faith leader level, and then after that, to devolve some of the responsibilities to our bureaucrats or technocrats in our respective religions and our organizations so that they could then go forward and build those mechanisms which are required. So I guess everything really comes down to systems, but for that to happen, we need to start talking. And I guess this is a step. This conversation that we're having, people across faiths and charity are having conversations, and I think hopefully something, at least after this, could build.
Thank you very much. I would say the key word is dialogue, definitely in overcoming prejudices on all levels, not only among refugees and migrants, but also among other minority groups, especially in Europe, where those divisions can really be visible somehow and tangible even more especially in the pandemic situation. I hope we will address that a bit later. So thank you very much, Imam Razavi, for your answer. And I would like to now shift a bit focus from religious perspective, maybe on education and the role of youth. And therefore, I would ask the question for Dr. Pritpal. Could you maybe explain a bit more from your perspective, how do you see the role of the role of education, in addressing the needs of refugees and migrants, both formal and informal education?
Sure, thank you for that question. And it was heartening to hear one of the other panelists address the importance of education as well. And in my day-to-day work, I focus regularly on K through 12 education, and I'm really passionate about the transformative power of education. And I concluded my presentation to highlight the importance, in particular, of values-led education in order to create long-term change to address issues that are facing refugees and migrants. On a very practical level, students should be prepared for a globalized world and understand the problems that exist on the global stage. So they should have opportunities to learn about migration, understand the reasons behind migration, and why it's a global responsibility to welcome refugees so that they can rebuild their lives in safety. And they should also have the opportunities to learn about the rich contributions of migrants and other minority communities to their local histories. But in parallel with this, they should also have the opportunities to learn about the change that can be harnessed through the power of values such as compassion, kindness, equality, sharing, and empathy, because this is the only way that long-term sustainable change can be made. Thank you.
Thank you very much for for your answer. And then when we speak about education, I would like to continue with the question for Ms. Anoud. What is the best way to engage youth in contributing to refugee policy? One recurring theme I have learned is a question from the audience about in studying peacemaking so far is dialogue. Have you found that engaging youth in intergroup dialogue helps with building the trust towards migrants that we have been talking about?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak on behalf of the youth on this very important challenge. As a youth, I believe their importance is very vital in providing solutions and challenges and in being creative. As the youth, they've chosen to focus on the three main challenges that in tackling them, you would really tackle all of the other challenges that would stem from those main ones. So in our last discussion last Thursday, the youth actually tried to focus on countering gender-based violence, ensuring equal employment opportunities, as well as also the social integration aspect of addressing issues of isolation, racism, and xenophobia. And we must realize that in any effort that aims to assist the social integration of refugees and migrants, whether men or women, but with a focus on women, three main pillars are key, which are education, health, and economy. The youth do realize the negative effect of the trauma, which is mentioned by one of the panelists, by the many refugees and migrants, and how these traumas can stand in the way of them being able to integrate within their new societies. And for this, the policy that were recommended by the youth were appropriate for that. It was ensuring the access of refugees and migrants to psychological therapy within the first 2 years, and also highlighting the importance of guaranteeing that policies and actions and also monitoring strategies are intersectional in the area of migration since the beginning of its formal planning, and also making sure there is flexibility and empathy in knowing that the experience and circumstances of each refugee is different than another refugee. Also making sure to include faith-based organizations and religious leaders to work with policy makers in order to provide support for refugees and migrants to ease any restrictions. I would also recommend creating policies in collaboration with judicial bodies in order to create direct reporting systems. They have also decided to focus on the aspect of countering gender-based violence, and they've provided tremendous policy recommendations for that. And they do realize that quite a number of policies to counter gender-based violence have been put in place. However, they are not implemented in the way that they should be, and they need to be emphasized. And that it's not about the lack of laws, but also the lack of enforcement that it so desperately needs. So the youth would like to take the opportunity to emphasize the importance of prioritizing the existing laws for gender-based violence, while also making sure to build a good prevention system and a good reporting system, and also access to healthcare for survivors, as well as any essential services and protections. As far as the last main area to tackle that youth chose to focus on, which is equal employment opportunities. As the youth, we realize that access to labor is essential in making sure migrants and refugees are sufficiently integrated and economically dependent. So raising the need to review any discrepancies within respective labor markets within the host countries that would stand in the way of employing refugees and migrants or validating their documents. That enables refugees and migrants to acquire skills and also build their experience and gain confidence in themselves as young professionals and female professionals. As well as we bring emphasis on removing any policies that stand in the way of economically empowering young professionals who are refugees and migrants, as well as offering them vocational training, freelance opportunities, as well as extensive social entrepreneurship programs that directly focuses on refugees and migrants. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Anoud. Just for clarification, these are proposed recommendations by the working group that you have mentioned, by the youth group that you have. Okay, so this will be developed or already it is developed as a set of recommendations that can contribute to policy change, I would say, or improvement. Thank you very much. And now I would like to ask a question from the audience to Professor Naso. Can you please repeat the 3 countries included in the project that you have mentioned, and what is the process they made, and how it took place in practice, and if there is a possibility to implement it with other European partners?
Thank you for the question. Absolutely, yes. This is exactly our goal, to try to involve other European partners in the program, because I think that the religious institutions have a big challenge. They have to prove, to test some experiment, but it is not their duty to give a continuity to this experiment, because policies is not part of the mission of the religious institutions. There are specific bodies who are entitled to provide policies and strategies to face properly migrations and global migrations. So I think that we took the responsibility to show that the model of the humanitarian corridors works. It works effectively. It works in the sense that there are safe passages and legal passages for the migrants, and they can be properly accommodated, because when they arrive in Europe, they are supported in terms of integration. We do believe that good immigration means good integration. Without any good integration, there is not a good immigration, and vice versa. So, yes, absolutely, we are involved to lobby, as it was told before, to enlarge the experiment at the European level. What we do in the local countries, in national countries like France, Germany, Belgium, where we experimented the model of the humanitarian corridors, is to try to connect at the beginning at least the Christian institutions. In Belgium, honestly, we succeeded to commit also other communities of faith, like Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and others. It was a really interfaith experiment. We need this because the state can provide the legal passage, so to say, the policy for the corridors, but integration is something that can be implemented by the communities of faith. The communities of faith have the skills, have the people, have the sensitivity, and the ability to take care of people, to accompany the people in a hard process of integration in new societies. So I think that this dimension of local groups, also little groups of people who committed themselves to follow and to support the migrant, is essential for the success of the model of the humanitarian experiment. Finally, I want to add that it is important also because we show, as it was told before, that we are together in the same mission. Unfortunately, we have been stressed by some sort of political strategy to divide the community of faith, to create a polarization, and especially a polarization and confrontation between Christianity and Islam. We have been victimized by this, in my personal opinion, political strategy, and we have to show that it is wrong. It is wrong as a strategy, and it is wrong as a vision. Because what it really happens in Europe and elsewhere is that Christian and Muslims, as well as people of other communities of faith, work together. This is our experience in Lebanon. In Lebanon, our Islamic partners, Christian partners, have been totally supportive of the program of the humanitarian corridors, and this is a vivid proof that we can work together, and that we are not polarized, we are not divided, but we are one in the same spirit and in the same mission.
Thank you, for Professor Naso, for this powerful message that you have pointed out towards the end of your answer, and thank you for answering questions that have been raised from the audience. And I would like now to address a question that and invite all of you to be included and invited to answer in our discussion now. And this is mostly related to perception of integration, as it is often seen as a way of assimilation. And my question would be, how can ethnic, religious, and cultural diversity be preserved, but at the same time not represent an obstacle for newcomers and obstacle for their social inclusion, for better integration? So how can those elements of cultural, religious, or ethnic identity, linguistic identity, be present and preserved and not being hidden when it comes to newcomers in the host societies? So I believe that we can address this from different perspectives, from your different countries and experiences. So I invite you to speak.
To answer now, because unfortunately I have to leave in a few minutes.
Please, Professor Naso, if you can address this, I know that your expertise definitely lies in.
Yes, it's a crucial question. Thank you for raising the point. Integration is the opposite of assimilation. We need a good integration. We have to refuse assimilation, because assimilation means that you have to get the similarities of your partner. You have to come as the other is. That is not natural at all. It's not natural. I am myself because I have my identity, my history, my background. I am proud to preserve it. So, what we need in our multicultural and multi-religious society is not to be the same, to be assimilated in the same culture or even in the same religion. It is totally out of any logic. What we need is to create a body where different opinions, different ideas, different cultures, different religions have something in common. And they experiment a mutual conversation about the specific values, traditions, and histories that we have in our background. In this sense, I think that interreligious dialogue, or interfaith dialogue, if you want, offers a very good model to our political, those who made our policies, our political decision makers. Because when we speak of interfaith dialogue, we can never imagine to become one. No, this is not the sense of our interfaith dialogue. I am a Christian, I am Protestant, and I want to stay what I am, and I am sure that my partners want to stay what they are. So our point is not to get one. Our point is to create a sense of communality. So the formula, so to say, the slogan is that we are diverse, but we try to reconcile our diversities. This is the model that has been implemented in the interfaith dialogue, how to reconcile diversities. I think that this is a model that comes from the religious communities, is offered to the politicians, to the political systems, who can implement policies where we don't try to destroy the identity, to minimize the identities, but on the opposite, we try to comprehend them in a spirit of communality and mutuality. So, for in this sense, we need, for sure, new policies, new policies. And of course, being an Italian, I appeal to the European Communion because the European Union succeeded in past years to propose a model of integration. But unfortunately, this model of integration has never been implemented, and it is exactly what we need now.
Thank you, Professor Nazo, very much. We have another raised hand. Miss Esther, please, and then Sheikh.
Just very briefly to affirm what was just said, that it is only when we are sure of who we are and are honest about our own convictions that we can truly reach out to those who have other convictions. If we are not authentic about our own profile, about our faith, our values, we will never be able to really reach out to the other and engage with them. And so I think teaching, learning that in our own faith communities, but also in engaging, that we don't need to hide who we are, play down the differences that we have in our values or faith traditions, etc. Doesn't mean we need to tune down our differences to share the much larger space of our common humanity. So that's one aspect. The other aspect I think we have to realize is, while we might not be migrants today, who knows what happens tomorrow? A lot of the migrant population we have today, 10 years ago, we would not have expected them to be migrants. And with Brexit, with COVID pandemic, we see how many people are forced to completely reorganize where they live, what they do, etc. So climate change, there are new things. So we need to, in that global education that was mentioned before, I think the fact that situations change, we might not be migrants today, but our parents were, our grandparents were, tomorrow our children might be. So let's learn those skills, how to accommodate one another, welcome one another, support one another.
Thank you very much, especially for emphasizing the important role of identity and how identity can still be kept, and it is important, and it is really multiple. In contemporary world, we all have multiple identities and not only one, and what is their role in a respective context. So Sheikh Abu Zaid, you also raised the hand to address this question. If you may start.
Again, from a Lebanese context, I will take the Palestinian refugees as an example. Not the Syrians, since they are in Lebanon recently. I will take the Palestinians since they are here in Lebanon for more than 70 years. By the way, I'm married from a Palestinian lady. It is the same language, Arabic. It is the same religious background. A Sunni Muslim, not only a Muslim, but specifically a Sunni Muslim. It is a very, very near culture. Even the kinds of food, we have the same kinds of food, the social structure, etc. Sometimes being very familiar with the community is a real challenge. The hosting community, when it is very alike you and very same as you, it is a very easy way to be dissolved in this hosting community. We realized that the Palestinian refugees are more interested in distinguishing themselves. Why? Not because of refusing to be integrated or refusing to be part of the local community, but because they wanted to preserve their cause, to keep their special identity as Palestinians. Then it was everything the same, and they still needed to keep some kind of history and some kind of identity to secure their cause and to secure the idea of going back home. But what we realized from the Lebanese side concerning integration and inclusion on the social and cultural level, since it is always there, it was the challenge was on the economical level. Palestinians in Lebanon are not allowed to practice 70 different jobs. Then if we are talking about inclusion and integration in Lebanon, we talk about it more in the economical field, turning the fields of work. While on the other hand, when it comes to social issues, it is always there, since historically we all were one country. The modern states, Lebanon, Syria, etc. These are very recent and very modern. Historically, it was the same geographical platform and the same people living there with the same language and culture. Then, in brief, sometimes the refugee community insists in keeping some kind of separation just to keep the specific identity. And when it comes to the hosting community, sometimes it is very inclusive in all levels. But in Lebanese case, when it comes to work and economical things, because of the bad economy in Lebanon, Lebanon was not very inclusive in this case.
Thank you very much, Sheikh Abu Zaid. I hope you can hear me well. I heard some echo in the background. Imam Razavi, I think you also wanted to address this question on ethnic, religious, and cultural diversity.
I was happy to listen, but now that you've put me in the position to... I was very quietly listening. It was quite educational for me to understand the dynamics at the moment. As the Sheikh has said in Lebanon, it's very eye-opening. I think at least on a European perspective, we actually have gone a step back as opposed to going forward in many ways. Politically anyway, with the EC, if you remember with the Article 17, President Barroso was very open in engaging with faith leaders from across the spectrum and making them quite welcome in the whole policy dynamic, which has now obviously taken a backseat, and with Brexit and then followed by COVID-19 is completely in the backseat. But at the same time, what has happened, which is positive, is that religions have begun a dialogue. A conversation has started. So I guess in Europe, if you from anywhere from KAICIID, Conference of European Churches, to the Vatican, to both Jewish and Muslim communities, I think that at least on an interfaith level, it's been really good. And I think multiculturalism does work. It is working in particular countries, not perhaps all of them, but especially if you go into history, you'll see that, for example, the United States had an ability to make refugees feel welcome historically. And same thing with New Zealand, same thing, I guess, to an extent with Canada. When you look at some of the more European countries, it's very difficult to be accepted. You look at France today, you look at polarization at the moment of the Muslim communities, especially those living in slums almost outside of Paris. You look at polarization which is taking place in Belgium. Without listing too many countries, there is a huge disparity at the moment that what Europe is saying on a policy level and what it's applying are two different things. So I think that perhaps we need to go back in history now, at least redevelop a linkage between Europe, or as it was once upon a time with the whole Article 17 and religious communities. Saying all of that, I think it is a promising time for faiths, at least on an interfaith level. I think a lot more intra-faith dialogue is required, ecumenical dialogue is required. But I think at least on the basis of religions, I think we are talking. And I do feel that it's promising, if not from a political perspective, as we've said in this conversation time and time again, there is a huge ramification when faiths come together with the wider constituent that they have to be able to influence policy. And so I think that at least if we carry on that dialogue, hopefully after COVID-19, things should be able to align themselves.
Thank you very much, Imam Razavi, for your answer. Dr. Pritpal, could you maybe comment a bit on this question where integration is often seen as assimilation, how religious, ethnic, and cultural diversity can be preserved or at least not hidden when it comes to refugee and migrant communities in the host societies?
Sure, and I'll answer this question again, maybe from an education perspective. And I think when engaging in multi-faith or interfaith education, it's really imperative that differences are celebrated and that uniquenesses are embraced. And we've heard some of the other speakers talk about introspection and the importance of dialogue within our own faith communities. And I think it's a really enriching exercise to explore what theological principles underpin various religious responses to pluralism. And from the Sikh perspective, given that we believe that there's one God who is the creator, as an extension of that belief, Sikhs believe that there is unity within diversity. And here I'd perhaps like to re-emphasize the importance of the values-led education, which I've mentioned a couple of times, because they're values which are common to so many faiths and which are universal values as well. And in my capacity at Religions for Peace, I serve on their standing commission on strengthening interreligious education, and where we're really hoping to produce a set of case studies which marry theory with practice and provide case studies of interfaith activities and joint service-based responses of religious communities to global issues such as the COVID pandemic and in their responses to refugees and migrants as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much for bringing a perspective from education as well to this question. And maybe for Ms. Anoud, the same question from the youth perspective. How would you comment on this important aspect of integration?
Thank you, dear Alexandra. I would like to bring to light the role of youth in creating safe spaces for diverse humans to interact and showcase their cultural identities and heritage, encouraging both parties, the host communities and migrants and refugees, to be proud of their identities, while also having common human ground. We see initiatives all around the world. Some are in Tunis using the role of arts in having that, building that connection between host communities and refugees and migrants. And we see it in Greece with the utilizing music and utilizing performance arts in order to bring people together. And I believe in the upcoming months, we will see more impact from youth around the world in creating organizations, associations, and just independent initiatives that would work on this issue and would create spaces for both refugees and host communities to interact, to see the human common ground that they have in common, and to also break any pre-existing stigma.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your important answer. Now I would like to address another question that I received from the audience, and this is when including refugees in dialogue, they often lack information, which is also the case with the host community, I would say. How it is possible to first educate and then empower them and then bring them to the table and start dialogue? So what are the possible ways to do that? Who would like to address this question or to start? Ms. Anoud, I see that you would like to start, so I encourage you to do so. Please, go ahead.
Thank you. My microphone. In regards to your question, which is a really important question, within last Thursday in our discussion as a youth, in particular onto how to tackle this specific challenge, educating the host communities on the integration, raising their awareness, and just raising their overall knowledge on this topic. we found that it would be best to create cultural communication dialogues within those communities, which would be utilized by religious actors and religious leaders who would start those conversations. We know for many people it is much easier to go or to trust the opinion of a religious leader that you do look up to or who follows your same faith. So we do really utilize that aspect of having communities be the connecting ground between host communities and refugees and migrants.
Thank you very much. Somebody else would like to address this question on educating refugees and migrants, preparing somehow the ground for dialogue on both sides, and raising awareness that is essential in that process of bringing people together at the same table and initiating the discussion. Miss Esther, please.
Well, I think in some of the refugee situations, it will be difficult because it's a surprise that you suddenly have those things. But knowing from the globalization experience that the global village is moving closer and we are meeting people that we had never expected to meet, I think the aspect of education host integrating in our educational efforts this whole thing of diversity and mobility and how things change and how we need to be sensitive and aware of those things. If we do that generally, I think there's a better basis to then turn up the volume when there's a rapidly changing situation. Now, I think, especially from the Christian faith background, but I know for many others as well, the value of hospitality towards the foreigner, the stranger, the vulnerable person is such a huge value that I think we, as part of our faith tradition, we just need to rediscover this whole value of welcoming the foreigners, supporting the others. If that is more part of our continued reflection in our own faith communities, it will not be such a shock to our system when it suddenly is needed. But if we are mainly focusing of our own internally, our own needs, our own comfort, our own benefits from our religion, instead of how we can be useful for a vulnerable neighbor, it will be a much bigger issue. So I think it's a challenge to all of us within our own faith convictions to just rediscover the value of being prepared and being servant to the neighbors that we have. And then once we are in our communities, to build that accountability, that integration is there. You know, even if you don't have refugees, you have marginalized people. And checking that as a group, as a faith community, who in our community is excluded, is marginalized, and bringing them in, including them, finding ways of doing this. When we build those muscles as an ongoing thing, once we get refugee communities, migrants into our communities, those muscles will be better built. And so I would hope that then it's an easier thing, that the floor is better prepared for it.
Thank you very much. Sheikh Abu Zaid, I think you had raised hand to address this question.
Again, such answer is different from country to country according to the context. Lebanon, as a developing country, we didn't reach the level of raising awareness and giving a kind of education to start a dialogue between the hosting community and the refugee community. To be honest, we didn't reach this level. When we talk about dialogue, when we talk about education and awareness, it is more focusing on life skills, talking about the refugees, talking about life skills, talking about adaptation and how to adapt in this new community you are living in. And by the way, some speakers said that the Syrians are living in refugee camps. This is not the case in all around Lebanon. Yes, in some parts of Lebanon we have camps, but in other places and my region here in the south, we don't have camps. The Syrians are living in the neighborhoods. Then talking about educating and raising awareness is to how to live with your neighbors, how to deal with your neighbors. It is more about life skills. It is about teaching some skills to earn a living. This is the main work that has been done here in my region. But we hope that we can forward to start raising awareness in more intellectual and more high level talk between the two communities to reach a common, I will not say a common ground, since we have a lot in common, but at least to make a kind of a harmony between the hosting community and the people who are living among the hosting community, and we call them refugees, while, as I mentioned before a lot of commonalities between both communities.
Thank you. Thank you for pointing out very important. We have some more questions from the audience, and I would like to address some of them, which are really critical for all of us, I guess, for addressing them, especially with the link with policymakers. So one of the questions I'd like to ask about the many problematic narratives that fuel fear against refugees. What can religious leaders do about that? How can alliances be built with policymakers? So I would invite you to maybe think about a few minutes and we can address this question, because this is really what we are actually aiming to do, to build alliances with policymakers to provide insights from insiders' perspectives, as well as from our experience as religious communities, faith-based organizations, or those who are really closely working with refugees and migrants or supporting them. Yes, Miss Esther, please.
I want to come back to a point that was made earlier, that it's often not about making new policies, but about enforcing existing things. And I think there our faith communities have a role to play. Very often we are not part of the local government discussion or at national level. And perhaps we need to be more courageous in speaking out there, or to get out of our comfort zone to start engaging, reaching out to certain areas. There are good mechanisms that have worked well in, like at local level, community accountability groups, where you take duty bearers and service providers and and those other people, you bring them all around the same table to discuss what are the policies, how are we doing them. It might be about health care provision or education care provision, etc. And then we see whether the community is doing their role, whether the government, the local government, the budget is being allocated, etc. And we then regularly meet to hold each other accountable for the progress of the action. So I think if we would be more engaged, so if the churches, the ummas, all the faith communities, we would be more part of the group that is engaged, that would already be a big thing. And I actually think that often we faith communities are sometimes being seen as a liability. So people are not so sure is it safe to engage us on political issues because they fear that we become a dividing force, sectarian or something. So we need to also establish the relationships and credibility. But then if we are seen as being an asset to really move things forward, I think that politicians, actors can actually really better engage with us.
Thank you very much. Anyone else would like to address this? Yes, Pritpal, and we will go around the screen, I would say. Dr. Pritpal, yes, please.
I just have two very short comments on this. One is when we were in the part of the question, that spoke about fear. I think dedicated efforts to increase religious and cultural literacy in the host country are very essential at all levels, at the policy level and at the grassroots level as well. And then I think removing those barriers for open dialogue between communities, whether that's language barriers, whether that's cultural barriers, and just to ensure that there's an equal and level playing field for that dialogue to take place, and the religious and cultural literacy for understanding to be able to be increased, and for fear to be decreased once that understanding happens.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Ms. Anoud.
Thank you, Alexandra, for giving me the floor. I would also like to emphasize the role of intercultural dialogue in breaking any stigmas or hate speech. We know that exposure to ideas that are based on fear is best done by dialogue. So increasing efforts to bring to the table host communities and also refugees and migrants with translators needs be, to have a dialogue on what it means to be a refugee and migrant and what it means to be a host community. Sometimes it's just sharing those experiences and sharing how they are living and what it means for them to be within the same space. Sometimes questions like these can break any kind of hate, stigmas, or any kind of fear.
Thank you very much. Sheikh Abu Zaid, how can alliances be built with policymakers? Let's address this, reiterate the question that we had.
Yes. And sorry to say it, sometimes we as religious leaders go to the extreme in being very hosting and caring and serving, while the politicians have a different agenda. When a politician thinks about a huge number of refugees, which is about 25% of the inhabitants of the country, and the burden of this big number of people on the economy, on the infrastructure, on the services, the politician will have a different agenda. The politician who needs to be re-elected from his community will not be very supportive to what religious people do, will not be part of this hospitality and this service. The politician will try to convince those who will vote for him that he is securing their future by not allowing these refugees to stay, by not allowing these refugees to take all kinds of jobs, by not allowing these refugees to have even a property in Lebanon. We have a Lebanese law that prevents refugees from owning property, from buying a piece of land or buying a flat. Why? This is what the politicians do. They try to convince the people that they need their votes, that we are doing good laws for you to prevent these outsiders, these refugees, from owning the country, from buying the country, from taking this country as a new country for them. And this is the sad story about the differences between the mind of the servants of God, the religious people who wants to serve anyone for nothing, and the politician who will think about gaining more votes to win the elections by making such new laws to convince his community that I'm securing your future this way. And now we can talk about the challenge and the difficulties between the social and religious sector from one hand and the political sector, and the gap between these two sectors.
Thank you very much for mentioning actually these discrepancies that exist between religious leaders and policymakers who quite often have different views on the same issue, and it would be also a challenge, and we would also need a way forward to overcome that. Imam Razavi, would you like to address also this question on how religious leaders can start dialogue with policymakers? What is the path?
I think very simply there needs to be a will from the policymakers to actually engage with religious leaders, because ultimately, as we've seen, at least I've seen over the last 20 years, depending on who the policymaker is when the policymaker is going to engage. At least from my perspective, from where I am, I've seen governments come and go. Those governments who are more favorable to faith, maybe a prime minister or a minister, maybe a person of faith, they'll engage in faith. So I don't think that religious leaders, if we are in our current prototype, have any influence unless or until we don't build a credible platform of religious influencers to influence global policy. You've got examples like that. For example, Religions for Peace is doing a wonderful job. It has the ability to be able to influence policy from a United Nations level to other countries across the world. So I do feel that there are existing platforms that require strengthening, where religious leaders can come together. And I think the big question that was raised was on accountability. And I think if there is a platform as a moral compass, let's say, or as a moral establishment, a multi-religious organization has the ability to hold certain individuals accountable. There needs to be a marriage between policymakers and people of faith or religious leaders. I think that will only come when it is seen that religious leaders have influence. And in different times, even in the last decade, in different times, you've seen that religious leaders have been influential in certain fields, in others. For example, this COVID-19 era, there's been a huge, at least in the UK, there's been a huge integration of religious leaders in the combat against COVID-19 and all the other parts of our roadmap to help our communities. So, and the reason being is that the government itself couldn't do some of the work that the religious communities can do. So I guess the question is, after COVID-19, are we going to have the same kind of engagement? And so I do find engagement is quite relative depending on what the situation is. But as I said, and I think my main solution is just that, to strengthen already existing establishments who have a cross or a diverse pool of faith leaders, such as our friend also has mentioned, Religions for Peace, who are quite a phenomenal organization in terms of having a span over 100 different countries and so forth, various chapters. If we can strengthen organizations like that, we can then hold governments to accountability.
Thank you very much. And also for addressing the current situation with COVID-19. Unfortunately, I must say, although we had 2 hours for our panel, the time passed so quickly that we are almost reaching the end. And for that end, I would like to ask the last question, which I believe that can nicely summarize some of your points that you raised and very important aspects that we have tackled today. And this is the question we have received from the audience. What are the speaker's recommendations to policymakers in this area? So maybe you can briefly summarize your recommendations that you see appropriate, especially tackling the question of youth and women, which is also the focus of our discussion today, among other things. So if we can go one last round of reflection on this, recommendations, summarizing them before we close our panel. Thank you. Who would like to start? Yes, Miss Anoud, please.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. It would be my privilege to come up with to showcase the recommendations put forth by the youth. So to go through it quickly, I know my fellow panelists have their recommendations to make as well. In regards to social integration, the youth do recommend extensive psychological therapy and free access to that, as well as creating an intersectional approach policy-wise, all the while making sure that creating policies in collaboration with host countries, judicial bodies, in creating an incident reporting system for racism, xenophobia, and any criminal activities or hate speech activities that would be perpetuated against those refugees and migrants. In regards to countering gender-based violence, the youth have recommended to build a good, resilient prevention system and reporting system of policies to ensure safe access by survivors to essential help and also protection, while serving the rule of justice, while also effectively enforcing the existing laws, which our fellow panelists have emphasized the importance of. We have a lot of pre-existing laws that do need to be enforced, that do need to be implemented to their full effect. As for equal employment opportunities, the youth do recommend that we review any discrepancies within respective labor markets that would stand in the way of employing refugees and migrants, and also creating an affirmative action plan to smooth the of refugees and migrants within the job markets, in creating vocational programs, offering platforms in partnership with local businesses and social entrepreneurships. In this way, we believe, or within these policies, we believe that we really do put them on their best foot forward. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Ms. Anoud. Anyone else would like to summarize some of the recommendations? Yes, Sheikh Abu Zaid, then Dr. Pritpal.
During war, there is destruction. The destruction of buildings, of infrastructure, but also there is another kind of destruction. It is the destruction of the social fabric and the destruction of families. We can borrow some money to rebuild the buildings, but it needs more effort and more time to rebuild the social fabric and to rebuild families. And I'm always saying to my community here, we can relief, we can think of food, we can think of many other things as a service, but also we need to support the family as a family. We can support the families, wives, husbands, and children from a social and cultural perspective to keep the unity of the family. Because even if we rebuild a destroyed country, when we don't have a strong family, it is nothing. It is nonsense. Then supporting families, supporting women, supporting children, and trying to strengthen families, the members of these families, and keeping this unity is a real essential thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheikh Abu Zaid. Dr. Pritpal, briefly, if you could reflect on the recommendations.
Sure. Just to kind of summarize, I know some of the other panelists have mentioned Religions for Peace, and I'd just like to read their concluding paragraph of their World Council statement, which was issued on the occasion of World Refugee Day back in June this year. And it states, on World Refugee Day, Religions for Peace, through its 90 national and 6 regional affiliated interreligious councils, platforms, and the interfaith youth and women's bodies, renews its commitment to systematically engage with one another and to serve the partnerships with UNHCR officers in intensifying multi-religious advocacy and action for the protection and well-being of refugees. This is our moral imperative because every action counts. So I hope that summarizes some of the themes that we've been speaking about today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pritpal. Very nicely presented and somehow concluded, I would say. Since our time is almost ended or ending in 2 minutes, if you would like to allow me now to express my gratitude to all panelists today for taking the time and sharing experiences, insights, and reflections on this important topic. I believe that we have tackled some important questions, but hopefully we also provided some answers to our audience and possible ways forward from different perspectives, addressing how we can have more inclusive policies, as well what is the role of religious actors and other actors in this process. Now I would like to invite our audience also to kindly fill out the evaluation form that is provided in the chat box. Last but not least, I would like to invite you to join our plenary panel tomorrow on religious action to address threats of climate change at 4 p.m. Riyadh time. I would really like to thank you all. Thank you all presenters. I really enjoyed this panel with you, and I'm really looking forward to other panels at G20 Interfaith. Thank you very much for your time.